Set. Good evening and welcome back. Most people think European civilization starts with Greece. The philosophy, the architecture, the democracy, the mythology. We treat ancient Greece like a light switch that got flipped on sometime around 800 BC. And suddenly, Europe went from darkness to brilliance. But that's not actually what happened, because before Greece, before the marble temples and the city-states and the Iliad, there was something else, something older, something stranger, and something so thoroughly swallowed by time that for centuries almost nobody even knew it existed. There was a civilization operating at the center of Europe's world, building structures that would impress architects today, sailing trade routes that stretched across an entire sea, and organizing society in ways that broke almost every rule we associate with ancient cultures. They shaped the world that Greece inherited, and then they vanished from the historical record so completely that later writers barely mentioned them at all. When they did, it was in myths and legends so distorted by time that historians dismissed them as fantasy for over 2,000 years. So, who were these people? What exactly did they build? And how does an entire civilization that powerful, that connected, that sophisticated, just fade from the memory of the world? Those are the questions this whole story is built around. And the honest answer is that we don't have all of it. What we have is archaeology, soil and stone, and fragments of art and destroyed buildings. We have scattered references from later Greek writers who were themselves working from second-hand accounts of a culture that had already been gone for centuries. And we have a writing system that nobody on Earth has yet been able to read. That last part should tell you something about how deep this mystery actually goes. But here's what we do know, or at least what the evidence strongly suggests. Before Greece rose to dominate the Mediterranean, there was a civilization on the island of Crete that ran the show. They built enormous palace complexes without walls, which is remarkable when you think about it. They sent ships loaded with goods across hundreds of miles of open ocean. They produced art of a sophistication and energy that genuinely shocks people when they see it for the first time. And they did all of this roughly 1,000 years before Socrates ever asked his first question. Try to picture it. Imagine waking up in a Europe organized not by city-states or warlords, but by palace economies humming with traders and artisans, where ships leave harbor before dawn carrying olive oil and bronze and dyed cloth toward ports you would need a modern map to even name. That was real life for real people for generations, for centuries, and almost nobody today could tell you their name. By the way, before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely check them. There's something that feels right about people scattered across the globe, all circling the same forgotten civilization together. So, let's actually meet them. The people we call Manoans weren't what you'd picture if someone said ancient civilization. They weren't Romans building straight roads across conquered territory. They weren't Egyptians carving their pharaohs into cliff faces 50 feet tall. They were something different, something that doesn't fit neatly into the standard template of how early complex societies are supposed to work. And that's actually the first thing you need to understand about them, because almost everything unusual about this civilization starts with recognizing that they wrote their own rule book. The name Manon isn't even theirs. We gave it to them. An archaeologist named Arthur Evans started excavating the site of Knos on Crete at the beginning of the 20th century, and needed something to call the people who had built it. He borrowed from the myth of King Minos, the legendary ruler of Crete, who features in later Greek stories about the labyrinth and the Minotaur. So, the name is a modern label attached to an ancient culture based on a legend that may or may not even be about them. What they called themselves, we genuinely don't know. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of detail that should stop you for a moment. We're talking about one of the most consequential civilizations in early European history, and we can't tell you what they called their own people. What we can tell you is when they appeared and roughly what they built. Human communities on Crete go back to around 7,000 BC, some of the earliest farming settlements in Europe. But the civilization we're really talking about, the one with the palaces and the trade networks and the fleet that crystallized much later, somewhere around 2000 BC, communities across Crete began organizing into something larger. The first major palace complexes appeared around 1900 BC, which historians call the protohistoric period. These weren't primitive experiments. They were sophisticated administrative centers from the start, capable of managing agricultural surplus, organizing craft production, and coordinating exchange across considerable distances. Then around 1700 BC, something disrupted the first palaces. Earthquake, internal conflict, possibly both. They were destroyed and rebuilt. And the second round, the Neoplacial period that followed, was even more impressive than the first set. That's the era we're really talking about when we say the Manoans were at their peak, roughly 1700 to 450 BC. 3 centuries of a civilization operating at a level that, given the time and place, was genuinely extraordinary. Now, here's where we have to be honest about what we know versus what we're inferring. We have the physical remains, we have the palaces themselves, the pottery, the fresco, the tools, the storage jars, the harbor infrastructure. We have trade goods showing up in Egypt, in the Levant, in mainland Greece, in the islands scattered across the Ion. We have enough material evidence to reconstruct the broad outlines of how this society functioned. But we don't have the documents, we don't have the court records, the census data, the trade agreements, the religious texts. That writing system mentioned earlier, the one nobody has decoded, is holding all of that hostage. So when scholars describe Minoan religion or Minoan political structure, or what exactly the palace administrators were doing, they're working from physical artifacts and inference. Careful, rigorous inference built by some of the best archaeologists alive, but inference nonetheless. Keep that caveat in the back of your mind as we go, because it matters. What the physical evidence makes unmistakable is geography, and geography is the key to understanding why the Manoans mattered so much. Sit isn't a small island. It's about 160 miles long, sitting right at the southern edge of the Aegean Sea, like a natural stepping stone between 3 continents. To the north, mainland Greece and the Aegean island chains. To the east, Cyprus and the coasts of Anatolia and the Levant. To the south, Egypt, barely 2 days sailing away in good conditions. To the west, the routes that eventually reach Sicily and the central Mediterranean. Crete sits at the intersection of all of it. Any ship moving goods between Egypt and Greece, between the eastern Mediterranean and the western, had to either pass near Crete or through the waters it dominated. That's not a coincidence that the Manoans exploited. That's an advantage they were born into, and then systematically built on for centuries. The Aegean itself in this period was essentially a network waiting to happen. Hundreds of islands, most of them visible from each other on a clear day, scattered across a sea that's calm enough in summer to cross in an open boat, but rough enough in winter to demand serious sailing knowledge. It's the kind of geography that rewards maritime expertise above almost everything else. The Manoans developed that expertise over generations, and once they had it, they had leverage. Not military leverage in the way we usually think of it, something subtler and in some ways more durable. Economic leverage, cultural leverage, the leverage of being the people who knew the routes, controlled the goods, and understood the connections better than anyone else operating in that world. That word, ruled in the way we're using it here, needs unpacking. When we say the Manoans ruled Europe before Greece, we don't mean they had governors in every province and legions marching to enforce tax collection. That's a Roman picture, and this isn't Rome. What the evidence suggests is something more like a center of gravity, a civilization so economically central and culturally influential that its reach was felt across the entire Aegean and well beyond, not because it conquered its neighbors, but because its neighbors organized their economies around it. Trade on Minoan terms, adopted Minoan artistic styles, looked to Crete for the luxury goods that signaled status and sophistication. That kind of dominance is harder to see in the archaeological record than a military conquest, but it's also often more total. You can resist an army. It's harder to resist being the thing everyone wants to be connected to. And then it ended. Or rather, it didn't just end. It was succeeded, absorbed, and then almost entirely forgotten in a way that seems almost designed. Later cultures moved into the space the Manoans had occupied. They adapted what they found useful and let the rest decay. Within a few centuries, a civilization that had shaped the entire Bronze Age Iron had been reduced to background noise. A few strange myths about a maze under a palace and a monster that lived inside it. That's the mystery, sitting at the center of this whole story. Not just what the Manoans built, but how something that significant got so thoroughly erased. And to even begin to understand that, you have to understand what they actually built in the first place. Walk into Knossos, and the first thing that disorients you is the scale. Not in the way a Gothic cathedral disorients you, all vertical ambition and deliberate awe. NSA spreads horizontally, sprawls, rambles through multiple stories, and interconnected wings in a way that feels almost organic, like it grew rather than got built. Evans excavated and partially reconstructed the site in the early 20th century, which means what you're seeing today is a complicated mix of genuine Bronze Age archaeology and his sometimes controversial interpretations of what should go where. But even stripped of the reconstructions, even looking at just the foundations and the lower courses of wall that survived intact, the complexity is unmistakable. This wasn't a house that got larger. It was a machine for running a civilization. And Nos wasn't alone. Across Cree, 4 major palace complexes emerged during the Neo-Palatial period. Nos in the north, Fistos in the south, Malia on the northern coast, roughly midway, and Zakros at the far eastern tip of the island. Each one occupied a strategically significant location relative to the sea and to the agricultural land surrounding it. Each one was built around a large central courtyard, oriented north to south, roughly the same proportions at every site. Whether that shared orientation reflects a common cosmological idea, a practical convention, or something else entirely, is one of those questions that remains genuinely open. But the consistency across 4 separate sites suggests it wasn't accidental. The central courtyard wasn't just an open space. It was the organizing principle around which everything else arranged itself. Storerooms radiating off the main complex, some of them still containing enormous ceramic storage jars called pithoi, some standing taller than a person, built to hold olive oil, grain, wine, dried goods. The sheer volume of storage capacity at these sites tells you something important about what the palaces were actually doing. This wasn't primarily a residence for a ruler, surrounded by a court. It was a redistribution center. Goods came in from the surrounding countryside, farmers and herders contributing surplus through what looks like some form of taxation or obligatory offering. And goods went back out to specialist crafts, people who depended on palace-managed supplies to workers engaged in palace-organized projects, possibly to trading partners abroad as well. The palace sat at the center of a web of economic relationships that extended across the entire island. Around the storerooms and the central court, you find workshops, evidence of textile production, bronze work, stone cutting, the making of luxury goods from materials that couldn't have been locally sourced, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ivory from Egypt or Syria, tin which has to travel even further to combine with iron copper and produce the bronze that everything in this period depended on. The fact that these exotic raw materials were arriving at Mano-in palace workshops and being transformed into finished goods tells you something about the reach of the networks these palaces were plugged into. They weren't isolated regional centers managing local agriculture. They were nodes in a Mediterranean-wide exchange system. The craft specialization visible in the palace workshops is extraordinary for the period. Minoan textiles were famous across the ancient Mediterranean, depicted in Egyptian tomb paintings as prestige imports worth trading for. Minoan stone vessels carved from local gypsum and harder imported stones show a technical mastery that still impresses specialists today. Metal work from palace workshops ranges from functional bronze tools to gold jewelry of breathtaking intricacy. This wasn't production for local consumption. This was production for a market that extended far beyond Cree, and the palaces were managing it. But here's the detail that stops most people when they first encounter it. None of these palaces had defensive walls. Spend time around Bronze Age sites in the AON and the Near East, and you get used to seeing fortifications, thick walls, reinforced gates, watchtowers, the whole architecture of anticipated violence. It's almost a given, but the Minoan palaces are open. No walls surrounding them, no obvious defensive architecture, no design choices that suggest the people who built them were worried about being attacked. This absence has been debated extensively, and nobody has arrived at a definitive explanation. The most common interpretation is naval power. If you control the sea lanes, if your fleet is strong enough that no enemy could land on your shores in significant numbers without you knowing about it well in advance, you don't need walls. Your defense is offshore, invisible, maintained by the same maritime expertise that drives your trade. It's a plausible argument, and it probably contains some truth. But there are other possibilities. A civilization built heavily on trade and cultural prestige might maintain security through diplomacy and mutual interest rather than military deterrence. If your neighbors depend on your trade networks, attacking you damages themselves. Walls might also reflect an ideology as much as a practical calculation. A palace that opens itself to the surrounding community, rather than fortifying against, it is making a statement about how it understands its own relationship to that community. Because the farmers and herders and sailors and artisans who surrounded these palaces weren't just subjects providing tribute to an isolated elite. The evidence suggests a much more integrated relationship. The palace organized their economy, managed their surplus, provided access to craft goods, and imported materials that they couldn't produce or obtain independently. In return, they fed and supplied the whole system. It was a relationship that presumably needed to be maintained through demonstrated benefit as much as through raw authority. Whether that relationship was always equitable or whether the people on the agricultural end of the fair is another of those questions the archaeology can't fully answer. But the physical openness of the palaces, their lack of walls, their position within, rather than above their surrounding landscapes, suggests something different from the heavily militarized palace cultures you find elsewhere in the Bronze Age world. Different in ways that once you start noticing keep multiplying. If the palaces were the brains of the system, the sea was its nervous system. Stand on almost any high point in northern Crete, and the pattern becomes obvious. The palaces we just talked about, none of them are very far from a good harbor. Kossos has easy access to the protected bay at modern Herakleion. Malia sits just behind a low-accessible stretch of coastline. Zakros is practically leaning over a secluded cove, looking straight towards Cyprus and the Levant. These weren't accidents of geography, they were choices. For the Minoans, the sea wasn't a barrier, it was the highway that mattered. Every civilization has a landscape it's optimized for. For Mesopotamia, it was river plains and irrigation canals. For Egypt, the strip of green hugging the Nile. For the Minoans, it was that broken necklace of islands, currents, and predictable seasonal winds we call the Aeon. If you know what you're doing, the Bronze Age Aegean is not chaos. The summer, meltemy winds blow reliably from the north. The islands are spaced like stepping stones, creep to the Cyclades. The Cyclades to mainland Greece and western Anatolia. Even in a small, relatively low-tech sailing ship, you can plan. And the Minoans appear to have planned very, very well. Archaeologists keep finding the fingerprints of Cretan seafaring in places where on the face of it Cretans have no business showing up. Minoan-style pottery in the Cyclades. Fresco styles echoed on the Greek mainland. Imports and imitations cropping up in ports along the Anatolian coast. Scarab seals and Egyptian fance objects making their way back to Crete. You can plot it on a mental map. Start from sit that long horizontal anchor at the southern edge of the Aeon. Draw lines north to the Cycladic Islands, Thera, Nakos, Paros, Melos. From their lines branch west to the Greek mainland, to places like Mycenae, Tyran, and the smaller coastal sites that predate their full rise to power, and east to western Anatolia, to harbors that will later belong to Troy, Mytis, and a dozen other city-states. Then stretch your lines south and southeast, down to the Nile Delta and the Levantine coast, Egypt, Byblia, Ugarit, the ports of Canaan and Syria. What you end up with is a spiderweb that centers not on some great continental power, but on an island. What were they actually moving along these lines? At the bulk level, the staples are familiar. Olive oil and wine in big transport jars, grain where possible, dried figs and raisins, maybe salted fish. Olive oil wasn't just food. It was light in the form of lamps. It was skin treatment. It was a base for perfumes. In a pre-petroleum world, good oil is a kind of liquid infrastructure, and Sitz Hills are perfectly suited for olive cultivation. Then there's pottery. Not as glamorous as gold, but pottery is the shipping container of the Bronze Age. Minoan potters seem to have been very good at making exactly what the trade network needed. Standardized storage jars, narrow-necked amphit for oils and wines, pouring vessels, cups. Some are plain workhorses, others are decorated in what we call marine style. Octopuses, dolphins, swirling sea plants. And those clearly aren't just functional. They're statements. Owning Minoan pottery isn't only about having a container. It's about possession of a recognizable aesthetic from a prestigious culture. Saffron shows up too, or at least the suggestion of it. Saffron crocus is depicted in Minoan art being harvested and processed, often in ritual-looking scenes. Real saffron is labor-intensive to produce and easily transportable in small quantities with high value. Given how later Mediterranean economies treat saffron, it's hard not to see it as one of those prestige goods moving along the Minoan routes. And then metals. Crete has copper sources, but no local tin worth mentioning. Bronze, the alloy that gives the entire age its name, needs both. So somewhere Cretan ships or their trading partners are bringing in tin from far away, maybe from central Anatolia, maybe in part from even farther afield, as later trade networks suggest places like Afghanistan or Central Europe passed hand to hand. Through many intermediaries in return, Cretans are exporting finished bronze tools and weapons, fine metal work, jewelry. The palatial workshops that we just walked through need more the ships bring it add to that small, high-status, exotica carved stone-owned vessels, inlaid daggers, gold signet rings, colored glass, fan, shell, and ivory. These are the things that end up in elite burials, the objects archaeologists get excited about. But for the Minoan system, they're not just trinkets. They're relationship tools. You don't just hand someone a beautifully carved ron or a set of dyed textiles and walk away. You're buying alliances, sealing agreements, feeding a feedback loop of shared taste. Because trade isn't only about stuff, it's about style. When Minoan pottery turns up on a Cycladic island, local potters start imitating the shapes. When Cretan fresco painters or trained painters decorate a wall in a palace on the Greek mainland, they don't just import images. They import an entire visual language set. Flowing lines, naturalistic plants, people leaping over bulls. Some of that is direct transfer. Maybe an artisan actually traveled. Some of it is imitation to distance. Make it look like the Cretan thing the chief's cousin saw in that foreign palace. The same happens with technology. It's one thing to receive a fancy bronze axe blade from Crete. It's another to arrange a steady supply of such blades. That pushes you either to maintain tight trade connections or to learn the production techniques yourself. Tin-bronze recipes, furnace designs, textile dyes, methods for sealing huge storage jars, even the accounting systems. The palace is used to track all this. Once these ideas get into a trade network, they're very hard to keep bottled up, and along with the objects and the techniques comes something less tangible, political weight. If you're a small coastal community in the Cycles, and your people sail regularly to Crete to deliver grain or wool and bring back oil, fine tools, and cult objects, your internal status structure is going to reorganize around those connections. The people who speak the right dialect of Minoan, who know the etiquette of the palace at Knossos, who can negotiate the next shipment or the next marriage alliance, those people matter. Some scholars think that's what lies behind the old Greek tradition that Minos ruled the sea. In classical sources, you occasionally see the word thyloscracy, literally rule of the sea, attached to Crete and to Minos in particular. Later writers imagine fleets patrolling the Aeolian pirates, suppressed islanders paying tribute. Did a literal Minoan navy enforce a top-down maritime empire? The evidence isn't clear-cut. We don't have definitive lists of subject cities or carved reliefs of triumphant kings with kneeling islanders. There are no fortresses on every promontory flying the Cretan equivalent of a flag. What we do have is a pattern. Cretan goods and styles dominate certain periods in the material record across the Aeolian. Cretan influence seems especially strong on some islands and coastal zones, and yet local cultures persist, adapt, and sometimes push back. One way to think about a Minoan theocracy is less as an iron-fisted empire and more as a kind of maritime commonwealth. Control through soft power being the indispensable node in a network of exchange. If you're the place everyone needs to go for certain goods, if your artisans have the look everyone wants, if your religious iconography quietly seeps into other people's shrines, you don't need to garrison their towns to influence them. You just need them to keep valuing what you provide. Another possibility is that Minoan power fluctuated. At some moments, especially in the height of the Neopalatial period, fleets might really have been the dominant naval presence in the central Aeon, able to project force when necessary and to discourage rivals. At other times, especially after disasters like the eruption at Thea, that dominance may have weakened, leaving room for mainland powers to step in. Either way, the sea is doing something particular here. It enables a kind of decentralized integration that land empires often struggle with. You don't need continuous territory. You need harbors, shipwrights, navigators, interpreters, and a shared set of expectations about weights, measures, and reciprocity. So, imagine for a moment one of those ships at the center of it all. It's late afternoon in a Cretan harbor, somewhere near Knossos coastal outlet. The ship is long and relatively narrow, its hull built by pegged mortise and tenon joints, wooden pieces carefully cut and slotted together, a technology we know Bronze Age shipwrights used. A row of O's rests along the sides for calm days and tight maneuvering. A single mast carries a broad square sail for open water runs. The cargo is as layered as the network itself. Down in the hold, heavy pithoi are wedged in with straw, a couple filled with olive oil, others with wine. Maybe one with grain for a particularly hungry island along the route. Between them lie copper ingots in that distinctive oxhide shape, easy to lash down and to carry on a human back when they're offloaded. A tightly wrapped bundle of dyed textiles destined for a local ruler who wants his cloak to scream, "I trade with Sit." A small chest with a few gold rings and carved stone seals, not for open market sale, but as diplomatic gifts. Near the top, a basket fragrant with crocus threads. Saffron as bright as fire, carefully covered. On deck, the crew are a microcosm of the world this network creates. A captain who's made this route a dozen times and read the currents by the way the foam pulls away from the rocks. A young sailor from a Cycladic island learning words and mentally rehearsing what he'll say when he reaches home. And everyone crowds around to hear about Knossos, a trader who has been to Egypt, who can point to artifacts in the cargo and say, "Over there, they have something like this, but in blue glass." And suddenly, everyone on board is thinking beyond even this trip. The harbor around them is busy, but not random. Scribes with clay tablets are noting quantities as goods move in and out. Dockside workshops are repairing hulls, twisting new ropes, boiling pitch. Somewhere above, back in the palace, someone will update an inventory and decide how much surplus can be risked on the next long-distance voyage versus how much stays in storage. From this one moment, a ship pushing off as the wind shifts, prow turning toward the open water. You can see how an island civilization might end up quietly binding half the eastern Mediterranean into its orbit, not with walls, with roots, with relationships, with a network woven across the sea so tightly that for a few centuries it feels less like separate coasts and more like different neighborhoods in the same extended world. And that network doesn't just move things, it moves ideas, images, and rituals, which is where the Manoans become even stranger. Because when you look at what they choose to decorate their palaces with, what they seem to celebrate and ritualize, you start to realize that their entire way of imagining power and the sacred may have been very different from the kingdoms around them. Walk into a Manoan palace in your mind and strip away the dust and missing pieces. The first thing that hits you isn't statues of kings or lines of soldiers. It's color, motion, and a very specific set of obsessions. The walls are alive with fresco, young people in flounced skirts and loincloths, hair streaming, leaping over bulls the size of small cars, processions of figures carrying vessels, liers, branches, dolphins swimming across blue bands that might be water, might be some symbolic boundary, on pottery and carved seal stones. The same world repeats in miniature. Spirals, waves, plants, animals, human bodies captured in mid-gesture. This isn't decorative wallpaper, it's a visual system. And when you line up enough pieces from enough sites, patterns start to emerge. Take the palaces. In places like Nos, Phistos, Zakros, the best rooms aren't filled with scenes of kings on thrones dominating their enemies. You get processions, rituals, feasts, dances. Even when there is a throne, like the famous stone seat at Moses, the surrounding fresco show griffins, plants, perhaps goddesses. The human figure, when it appears, is usually participating in some kind of performance or offering, not radiating solitary military glory. It looks like a society where status is staged as participation in shared spectacle, not as one man towering over everyone else. That carries over into the small stuff. Clay cups with elegant, almost careless curves. Storage jars painted with ivy. Octopuses. Reeds bending in the current. Tiny gold rings engraved with scenes so detailed you need magnification to appreciate them. A woman standing on a peak with a shrine and sacred tree. A group approaching a building with horns on its roof. Someone human or divine receiving an offering. Seal stones used to mark ownership and authorize transactions are particularly revealing. If you come from a world of bureaucracies, you might expect heraldic crests or stark symbols of rank. Instead, Manoan seals often show active scenes. Humans interacting with animals, dancing, harvesting, praying, wrestling with bulls. Authority is stamped through images of participation, ritual, and relationship. So, what's going on religiously. Cree is dotted with places that clearly weren't just everyday spaces. High on ridges and mountaintops, you find what archaeologists call peak sanctuaries, rough enclosures, simple altars, piles of offerings, broken clay figurines of humans and animals, miniature tools, little models of limbs, may be left as thanks or requests for healing. From these heights, you can look back over the fields, the villages, the sea. It's not hard to imagine people climbing up here with offerings, when the first rains fell late, or when a child was sick, or when a ruler wanted to stage a dramatic public ritual visible for miles. Then, there are the caves. Cree is full of them, and a surprising number show traces of cult activity going back to the Bronze Age. Deep, cool, often wet places with stalactites glistening like ribs of stone. In some you get altars, deposits of pottery, figurines. Later, Greeks would say gods like Zeus were born or hidden in these caves. But the cult goes back before those stories. Peaks above, caves below, a vertical sacred landscape that frames daily life between sky and underworld. In the middle of this, the palaces themselves act like ritual machines. Central courts almost certainly hosted big public ceremonies, processions emerging from side rooms, dancers crossing the space, animals led in, maybe even bulling events or something akin to them. Side shrines and pillar crypts, small rooms with central pillars marked by incis signs, sprinkled with offerings, suggest more restricted rites, maybe for specific groups or officials. What's striking is that many of these religious spaces are embedded in the very architecture where administration happens. Storage magazines with religious symbols scratched into the walls, doorways marked by horns of consecration, pairs of stylized stone horns set up like a frame. Ritual isn't off in some distant temple district, it's threaded through the spaces where you weigh grain and tally oil. Which brings us to the recurring motifs that almost define Minoan culture. Bulls first. They're everywhere in fresco on seals as Ritter. Those carved stone or ceramic pouring vessels, shaped like bullheads. The famous bulloping scenes show acrobats vaulting over a charging animal, hands on the back, bodies in impossible arcs. Whether this was a literal sport, a mythological scene, or a ritualized symbol, we don't know, but the bull clearly matters. In many agricultural societies, bulls stand for raw power, fertility, the dangerous strength harnessed to plow fields and pull heavy loads. In Minoan art, that energy seems to be something humans interact with, dance around, maybe even master theatrically, not simply slaughter. Then there are the horns of consecration, those U-shaped stone or clay constructions that look like stylized bullhorns. They sit on palace roofs, in courtyards, framing entrances, even on miniature models of buildings and altars. They don't do anything functional. Their job is to mark space. Put horns on a roof, and you're saying, this building participates in the sacred. Set them by a doorway, and you're telling everyone who passes through that the threshold they're crossing isn't ordinary. It's like a visual tag for divine presence repeated so often that it becomes part of how people read architecture instinctively. The double A, the labies, is another core symbol. We see it carved into pillars, painted on walls, engraved on tiny gold sheets, even cast in bronze as offerings. It's often depicted too large to be a practical tool. It feels more emblem than weapon. Later, Greeks associated double axes with sacrifice, and with female divinities in Anatolia and the Aeon. In Minoan context, the labri shows up in shrines and near what looked like altars. It may have been a symbol of a deity of priestly authority or of the act of ritual killing itself, turning the capacity for violence into something bounded, rule-governed, sanctified. Bulls, horns, double axes, power animals, and power tools transformed into signs. Together, they create a world where authority doesn't have to shout, "I have the most soldiers." It whispers or chants, "I am the one who knows the rituals that keep the world in balance." Gender, in this imagery, adds another twist. In a lot of Minoan scenes, especially in elite and ritual contexts, female figures are front and center. Women in elaborate flounced skirts and open bodices stand on platforms, receive offerings, handle ritual objects, dominate the middle of compositions. Male figures are often more mobile, running, leaping, pouring, carrying. Some scholars, especially in the 20th century, took this to mean Minoan society was a kind of matriarchy, with powerful priestesses or a supreme mother goddess at its core. Others caution that we might simply be seeing idealized images, ritual roles, not a census of who actually held power. There are also practical concerns. Clothing and skin color conventions in the art. Women often painted light, men dark, following an Egyptian convention may tell us more about visual grammar than real social hierarchy. What does seem reasonable is to say that femininity, fertility, and the human capacity to mediate between nature and the divine were visually important. Whether that translated into women dominating political decisions, we just don't know. Status is just as slippery. There are certainly elite markers, more elaborate jewelry, taller hats, more expensive pigments, more complex settings. But you don't see a repeated image of a single identifiable king conquering enemies and stamping his name on everything. Authority is presented as membership in a ritual class, participation in processions, proximity to sacred symbols, not as one exceptional individual standing alone above the crowd. And that leads to a bigger question. How do you hold a complex society together if you're not constantly showing off your army? One answer is you build a world where people are emotionally invested in the rituals that justify the system. Imagine you live in a town under the shadow of Knossos. A couple of times a year, you and many others walk or ride up to the palace for a festival. You pass under horns of consecration, hear music, smell incense, and roast meat. See acrobats risk their lives in the bull ring. Watch priests or priestesses perform acts you're told. Keep the rains coming and the seas favorable. Food is redistributed. Wine is poured. You get to be part of something larger than your village, larger than your lineage. In that kind of setting, the palatial elite don't have to point at fortifications to justify their role. They can point at ceremonies, at the storerooms full of offerings, at the continuity of rituals that your grandparents also attended. Their power is stabilized, not only by force, which they surely could use when needed, but by spectacle, by shared belief, by the feeling that this is how the world works. Ritual can do what walls do in other societies, define insiders and outsiders, reward obedience with inclusion, and threaten exclusion without having to draw a sword every 5 minutes. And this theatrical symbol-laden system doesn't stay on. When you look at mainland Greece in the generations before and after Messini rises, you see local elites borrowing Minoan tricks. Fresco programs in places like Mycenae and Tiryns suddenly sprout Minoan-style borders, Minoan color schemes, even full scenes of processions and bulloping. Mainland tombs contain imported or locally made imitations of Minoan seal stones, rings, and writer. Shrine layouts start to echo Cretan designs. These aren't random borrowings, they're deliberate choices. If you're a rising chief on the mainland and you want to show your followers that you're plugged into the big prestigious world across the sea, you commission your hall to be painted the Cretan way. You pour wine at feasts from a bull's head written. You mark your building with horns of consecration. You adopt the symbols of a network that for generations has been associated with wealth, skill, and access to exotic goods. In other words, Minoan culture becomes a kind of soft power package. You don't have to be ruled by numbers to be ruled by its style. And that in turn makes the Minoan story even stranger, because while others are busily copying their art, their rituals, their aesthetic of power, something else is happening back on Crete. Pressures building, tensions rising, cracks appearing in the world that bulls and double axes were supposed to keep stable. If ritual is the public face of Minoan power, writing is its backstage voice. Deep in those palaces, in the storerooms, the side offices, the quiet corners where scribes sat, another system was at work. Not painted in bright pigments, pressed, scratched, and rolled into wet clay. On Crete, you don't just get one script set. You get two early ones that belong to the age of the Minoan palaces. Crete and hieroglyphs, and something called linear, both seem to grow out of the same need. Keep track of a complicated world of goods, people, and obligations. Both are tied, as far as we can tell, to the palace system, and both are maddeningly silent about the things we most want to know. Crete and hieroglyphs show up first. The name makes them sound like they're related to Egyptian, but hieroglyph here basically just means little pictures. They appear on seal stones and clay documents from early palace sites, especially in Central and Eastern. You see tiny images, human figures, animals, tools, plants, abstract shapes. Some are clearly used like signs in a script. Others might be decorative or symbolic. Sometimes they're carved into stone seals that officials use to stamp clay nodules attached to containers or doors. Sometimes they're impressed one by one into little clay bars and labels. It looks like an early experiment in turning symbols into a system. The seals carry not just pretty images, but bureaucratic authority. Stamp this storage jar with this combination of signs, and everyone knows whose domain it belongs to, what kind of transaction it represents, maybe even which office processed it. Then around the time the big neo-political centers bloom, Konos, Visto, Malia, Zakros, another script appears. Set. Linear A, where Cretan hieroglyphs are pictorial and dense, Linear A is stripped down, made of clean, simple strokes, hence the name linear. The signs are arranged in lines left to right on flattened pieces of clay. When archaeologists started finding these tablets in palace ruins, lined up in shelves or scattered on floors, dirt-baked by ancient fires, it changed the way people thought about Minoan society. Because whatever else you can say about a culture, if it's producing hundreds and hundreds of clay tablets, ceilings and labels covered in standardized signs, it has a bureaucracy. The tablets themselves are almost comically unglamorous. No hymns, no myths, no royal autobiographies. What survives are the boring bits that happen to be fireproof. You get short formulaic entries, a heading sign or two, then sequences of numbers next to words written in Linear A. The numbers we can read, the signs that mean 10, 100, specific fractions, tally marks across different sites. The structure repeats at FTOs. A tablet might list a place sign, a sign that probably labels a commodity, then numbers. At Hakka Triada, rows of entries track deliveries of grain or oil or textiles. At Gnosis, clay nodules, small lumps attached to bundles, jars, doors, bare impressions of sealstones, and quick scribbles in Linear A, like ancient barcodes. Set. Taken together, this archive, although fragmentary, paints a picture. Minoan palaces weren't just pretty ritual machines, they were clearing houses. They took in goods from surrounding territories, grain, oil, wool, raw materials, crafted items. They stored, processed, repackaged, and sent them back out. They tracked who owed what, who received what came from which district, maybe even what was destined for foreign partners. You don't get that kind of system without a cadre of trained scribes, without standard measures, without some shared understanding of how information should be recorded and retrieved. We can see the skeleton of this administrative beast, but its thoughts, its inner language remain out of reach. Because we still can't actually read Linear A, we can transcribe it, we can label the signs. We can talk about sign A301 or A08. In many cases, we can guess that the structure is similar to Linear B, the later script used by the minions on the mainland and at Gnosis after they take over. And that similarity is part of the TEs. When Linear B tablets were first discovered, they look like Linear's cousin. Same basic sign shapes, same line-based writing, many overlaps. For decades, nobody could read either. Then, in the 1950s, Michael Ventris and others cracked Linear B. The key revelation, it wasn't some exotic lost tongue. It was an early form of Greek. Set. Once you know a script writes Greek, you can test phonetic values for signs. Look for familiar place names, common words. Suddenly, the Machinian archives open up. They tell you about wax as king and Lars, about chariot wheels and bronze and slave girls and perfumed oil. You can map out the structure of a palace economy, the ranks of officials, the distribution of land. With Linear A, people tried the same trick. If Linear B is Greek, maybe Linear A is just an older form of Greek, written with mostly the same signs. It doesn't work. Apply the Linear B sound values to Linear A, and you get strings of syllables that don't match Greek words. A few place names seem to carry over, which makes sense if the MCI Naians borrowed older Crete, and toponyms, but most of the language underneath refuses to resolve into anything familiar. The current consensus is cautious. Linear A uses many of the same or similar signs as Linear B, probably with related phonetic values, but it's writing a different language, one we don't otherwise have. That's the core of the problem. Decipherment needs anchors. Ideally, you want a known language written in an unknown script, or an unknown language written in a known script, or best of all, a bilingual inscription, the Rosetta Stone scenario. With Linear A, we have an unknown language written in a partially known script with no bilingual help. The documents are short. They're mostly administrative. Many words are probably personal names, place names, or technical terms that wouldn't have exact matches elsewhere, even if we knew the language family. So, scholars do what they can. They compare sign frequencies. They identify recurring sequences that probably mean things like total or dedication or for the god. They use context. If a sign sequence appears on multiple tablets next to varying numbers but in a fixed column, maybe it's a commodity: grain, wine, wool. If a word shows up mostly in what look like offering lists, maybe it's a deity or a ritual term. Over time, a hazy picture emerges of Minoan accounting formulas, maybe even of a few cultic words, but the real meaning remains mostly hypothetical, and the bigger question, what language is actually being written, is still open. Some researchers argue that the underlying language might belong to an early family we know from Anatolia or the Near East, related in some distant way to Luwian or Hattic or something even older. Others suggest a link to later Greek place name elements we see scattered across the Aeonin, hints of a vanished tongue underlying Greek toponyms. There are theories tying it to Semitic languages, to Indo-European outliers, to totally isolated lineages that left no descendants. Every proposal has problems. Sound correspondences don't quite line up. Grammar has to be partly imagined. The tiny corpus makes it possible to build elaborate models that can't be decisively falsified. So the honest answer is, we don't know what the Minoans called themselves. We don't know what they called their gods, their rituals, their own island. We can see the marks of their language, but we can't hear its voice. Compare that to the Linear B world. Once Linear B was cracked, Myenian palaces stopped being ghostly. Suddenly, you can read lists of tripods with handles, women workers from numbers, bronze given to the smiths of such and such place. You see that they had word forms recognizably ancestral to classical Greek: potter for potna, lady, a powerful goddess figure; Cassiu for basileus, originally more like chief than later king. You can trace how they organize their territories into districts, how they track flocks, how they use specific terms for officials and specialists. You get a feel for their preoccupations: warge gear, chariots, male elites, land holdings. With Mono and Linear A, the structure of the documents looks kind of similar. Headings, lists, totals, maybe temple inventories, maybe rations, maybe offerings. But without knowing what the words actually mean, we can't say whether the pallial elite were calling themselves something like king, or steward, or high priest. We can't read their prayers, if any, survive. We can't see their own conceptual world, only the shadows it throws on accounts. That's where the stakes come in. When a civilization's writing is unreadable, it's as if we're looking at it through soundproof glass. We can reconstruct the architecture, the pottery, the trade routes. We can admire the art and imagine the rituals, but the people themselves, their stories, arguments, metaphors, jokes, laws stay locked away. For Mono and Cree, that lock is particularly frustrating because the scripts are right there, sitting in museums, in drawers, on shelves. We can count how many sheep some official recorded on a given day, 3,600 years ago. We can hold the tablet in our hand. We just can't understand the words he used to do it, and that makes it much easier historically for someone else's story to overwrite yours. By the time writing returns to Cree in a form we can read with Linear B under my control, the language of the tablets is Greek. The names of gods, officials, and places are filtered through a mainland lens. The palaces are still there, some rebuilt, but the voice recording their business has changed. Later Greeks, centuries after the palaces fell, will tell stories about a king named Minos, about a labyrinth, about monstrous bulls and heroic Athenians. They'll fold Cretan memories into their own mythic universe, giving them Greek names, Greek motives, Greek morals, without the Minoans' own words to push back, to complicate or contradict those stories. It's easy for their civilization to feel like a prelude, a backdrop, a mythic stage set for someone else's epic, but the unread tablets say otherwise. They tell us that Minoan Cree had its own language, its own administrative jargon, its own technical vocabulary of ritual and economy, a whole conceptual world running for centuries, parallel to the better documented traditions of Egypt and Mesopotamia. We just happen to be standing on the wrong side of the locked door. And while that door stays closed, other parts of the story have to carry more weight. The stones, the ships, the scars left by disaster. Because Sit's script becomes eerily quiet, just as the island is hit by one of the most violent events the Bronze Age Aeon would ever see. Out in the Aeon north of Cree, there's a ring of cliffs wrapped around a flooded blue caldera. Today, we call it Santorini. In the Bronze Age, people called it Thura. Back then, it wasn't a broken ring. It was a mostly whole island, with a big volcano simmering quietly under the surface. And then, sometime in the mid-second millennium BCE, it stopped simmering. The Thera eruption is one of those events that almost feels like it shouldn't be real, the kind of thing you'd expect in myth, not in geology. This wasn't just a local eruption dusting a few nearby fields. It was a full-scale, high-end explosive event, often put near the top of the volcanic intensity scale. Imagine a blast strong enough to blow the central part of an island straight into the sky, collapsing the ground into a crater kilometer across. Imagine ash columns punching into the stratosphere, spreading a veil of fine particles over half the eastern Mediterranean. Thera did that. The island itself records the violence. On Santorini, you can walk along cliff faces where the layers stack up like a book of catastrophe. At the bottom, normal soils, older human occupation, set. Above that, a thick sequence of white pumice and ash meters deep fallen from the sky in a matter of hours or days. Above that again, post-eruption sediments, new landscapes recolonized by plants and people long after the dust settled. In some places around the Aeone, that ash shows up as a thin, distinctive layer. A time marker on cores pulled from lakes and marshes, in seabed sediments. On excavation floors, you get traces of this fallout. Microscopic glass shards that geochemists can match back to Santorini's magma like a fingerprint. And ash in the air was only part of the story. Most reconstructions think the eruption unfolded in stages. Initial explosions, ash and pumice raining down, then catastrophic collapse of the central cone. When a huge volume of volcanic rock drops into the sea at once, the water has to go somewhere. It goes outward. That's where the tsunami hypothesis comes in. If you picture the map of the southern Aegean Crete down here, the up there, smaller islands scattered in between, and then you drop a chunk of mountain into the water between them, it's not hard to imagine what happens next. Walls of water racing outward in all directions, slamming into shorelines, wrapping around headlands, funneling into bays and harbors. On Sit's north coast, a string of Minoan harbors and coastal settlements faced almost directly toward Thera. Places like Amnisos, Palicastro, Malia's coastal outskirts. Archaeologists digging at some of these sites have found what look like chaotic destruction layers, buildings smashed in odd ways, debris full of sea sand and marine microorganisms thrown inland, clusters of human and animal bones jumbled together. Are those tsunami deposits? In some cases, the evidence points that way. In others, it's more ambiguous. Storms can move sand, too. Earthquakes can topple houses without any wave at all. That's one of the tricky parts with the Thera story. It's tempting to imagine a single clean cause and effect chain. Volcano explodes, tsunami hits, Minoan civilization falls. Reality looks more complicated. What we can say with some confidence is this: the eruption was huge. It blasted an astonishing amount of material into the atmosphere. It poured ash into the sea. It probably generated a series of tsunamis, and it happened in the middle of a highly connected maritime world where Cree's power depended on ships and harbors and stable trade routes. Interruption alone, even without total annihilation, would have mattered. Think about what we've already seen of the Minoan network. Palatial centers acting as hubs, ships running regular circuits to the Cyclades, to the Greek mainland, to Anatolia, to Egypt, and the Levant. Exotic materials flowing in, finished goods flowing out, religious ideas, symbols, and artistic motifs hopping from port to port. Now drop into this picture an event that even for a year or two makes parts of the Aeon effectively unsailable. Ash clouds that mess with visibility and weather. Floating pumice rafts clogging narrow channels. Harbors choked with debris. Key islands including Thera itself, which was clearly part of that network, simply gone or rendered unusable. You don't have to wipe off the map to cause serious trouble. You just have to sever enough of the arteries feeding its palatial heart. The site of Akriteria on Santorini shows you exactly what was at stake. Before the eruption, Akriteria was a thriving town. Multi-story houses, complex drainage systems, storage rooms with pithoi, big storage jars stacked neatly, wall paintings that rival anything found on Crete in color and sophistication. It looks archaeologically like an Aeon cousin of the Minoan world, plugged into the same economy and sharing the same visual language. When the volcano started acting up, something interesting happened. The people of Akriteria seem to have gotten a warning. There are no obvious human skeletons in the eruption layer there. No Pompeii-style crowds frozen in ash. Instead, you find houses with furniture moved, storage containers emptied, valuables taken, as if residents had time to pack and flee. The buildings eventually collapse under the weight of pumice, but the town itself dies quietly. The disaster is geological, not a sudden massacre. That rescue by timing is our gain, because Akriteria is essentially a time capsule for Iron High life, right before the eruption. Inside those houses you see wall paintings of ships in procession, harbors buzzing with life, flotillas moving between rocky islands topped with little towns. You see landscapes with flowering plants and monkeys, imagined or imported. You see women in elaborate robes and jewelry, processions, rituals, maybe even scenes tied to a seasonal festival. This isn't just Manoan art exported. It's an entire community living inside that same shared cultural sphere, adapted to its own island, but clearly connected to Cree via trade, style, and probably religion. And then, in a geological blink, their island is torn apart. For Sit, losing Thera and its Cycladic neighbors as stable partners would have been a serious blow. Imagine a logistics map. Key staging point removed, shipping lanes suddenly more dangerous, friendly harbors gone, a psychological shock hanging over everything. Now layer on another problem, dating. You'd think an eruption this big would be easy to pin down precisely. It's not. For decades, scholars used pottery sequences and Egyptian historical records to anchor the event. The relative dating went something like, find the pumice in Egyptian contexts, match it to known reigns of pharaohs, cross-check with styles of imported ceramics. That approach tended to push the eruption down closer to 1500 BCE after the period of peak Manoan palatial prosperity. Then radiocarbon got involved. Organic material buried by the eruption, branches, seeds, charred remains can be dated using carbon-14. A number of those samples combined with tree ring sequences and ice core layers that might record volcanic signals seem to indicate an earlier date, something more like the late 1600s BCE. That's a big difference, a century or more. If the eruption happened closer to 1600, it would line up with the height of the so-called Neopalatial era on Cree, when the great palaces were at their richest and artistic output was at its peak. In that scenario, the eruption might be the beginning of the end, a blow that destabilizes a flourishing system and sets up later crises. If it happened nearer 1500, it might fall into a period when Manoan power was already fraying for other reasons, making the more of a heavy push on something already leaning. Different chronologies tell different stories. One version, Thera is the thunderbolt that hits a robust empire. Another Thera is a brutal aftershock in a landscape already full of cracks. The debate isn't just academic nitpicking. It shapes how we understand the relationship between natural disaster and social change. Either way, what the archaeological record on Cree itself seems to show is not a simple everything burns the day after the volcano scenario. The big palaces don't all collapse in one synchronized moment associated with the ash. Some are damaged, rebuilt, modified. Some seem to keep functioning perhaps at reduced capacity. Trade with the wider East Mediterranean doesn't completely stop. Egyptian and Levantine goods continue to appear. The linear, administrative machinery keeps ticking for a while. That's where the idea of shock to the system becomes useful. Complex societies can absorb a lot. They have buffers, stored surpluses, political alliances, diversified trade, religious narratives that make sense of disaster. What they don't like is repeated compounding stress. A volcano of the magnitude can't help but be one of those stresses. It likely damaged or destroyed parts of the Manoan fleet, ruined coastal installations, disrupted regular trade routes to key partners, hit psychologically the gods themselves, tearing the sea apart, possibly altered regional climate for a few years, affecting harvests. But it didn't instantly wipe Cree clean. It weakened a web of interdependencies. It cut a few major threads, maybe snapped others halfway through. The system kept going, but now more brittle, more vulnerable to later shocks. Meanwhile, Akriteria, sealed under meters of ash, sits as a silent witness with murals of ships and harbors frozen in the moment before impact. A world in motion paused mid-breath. So when later Greek stories talk about a great island power punished by the sea or a civilization sunk beneath the waves, it's hard not to hear an echo. Maybe not of Atlantis, as some like to claim, but of a real memory, a time when a brilliant Aegean network suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered. Yet the final act hadn't played out, because on Cree, long after the ash stopped falling and the Pumi's rafts dispersed, The palaces still burned, not from volcanic fire, but from something much more human. If Thera didn't finish the job, then what did? When archaeologists say a palace burned, they're not just being dramatic. On Crete, at places like Nos, Phistos, Malea, and Zakros, you can literally walk down through the soil and feel the moment when everything changes. Above you get later debris, scattered stones, eroded fills, bits of pottery from people living among the ruins or reusing old walls. Then as you go deeper, you hit a compact, distinctive horizon. Charcoal-rich soil turned almost black, broken mud brick baked hard by intense heat, fallen roof beams reduced to carbon ghosts, storage jars fractured in place, their contents flash-baked or exploded, in some cases walls re-end or vitrified, where the fire got hot enough to alter the stone itself. That's a destruction layer, a scar in the stratigraphy. It's not just rubble. It's rubble that has been through fire. Archaeologists read those layers like crime scene investigators. They ask, where did the fire start? In storerooms, in upper floors? Do the collapsed floors and roofs show a particular direction of fall? Are there sling stones, arrowheads, or weapons embedded in the debris? Are there crushed skeletons, people trapped by sudden collapse? Do valuables still sit on floors and shelves, or were they removed? Is there any sign that someone came back to clean up? Because how a place dies says a lot about what killed it. The Minoan palaces don't all tell the same story, but they rhyme. At many sites, we see a major destruction horizon in the later 15th century BCE. The so-called final palatial period comes to an abrupt fiery stop. Thick burn layers cap the last linear records, the last full expression of that old Minoan palatial system. Konos is complicated as usual. It burns, but it also gets rebuilt and reoccupied, apparently under different management. Other palaces like Zakros on the far east coast look more like they were hit and left. So what happened? The honest answer is nobody can prove a single neat explanation. But there are several major suspects, and each has evidence in its favor and problems. One candidate is the Earth itself. Crete sits in a seismically active zone. Even today, earthquakes are regular visitors. In the Bronze Age, they were probably even more frequent companions as tectonic stresses adjusted across the AON. At several Minoan sites, you get signs of quake damage. Walls shifted off their foundations, floors buckled, staircases collapsed without clear burn. Some destruction layers show a pattern of toppled masonry that looks more like shaking than fighting, and earthquakes can cause fires. Imagine oil lamps falling over, the hearth spilling embers into storms full of grain, olive oil, cloth, wooden beams. Once that kind of complex catches, it can become an oven. You don't need enemy soldiers to explain charred archives and baked brick. There's also the possibility of earthquake sequences. Not just one big event, but a series of tremors over years or decades. In that scenario, you don't get a single the day it all ended. You get repeated blows, repair, rebuild, another quake, more damage, corners cut, structures weakened. Every cycle drains labor, resources, and political goodwill. Add a few fires into that pattern, and the palaces might simply reach a point where rebuilding yet again isn't worth it or isn't possible. But geology alone might not tell the whole story. Another suspect is internal revolt. The palaces were not cozy village co-ops. They were centers of authority. They controlled land storage redistribution. They organized labor for building projects and agricultural work. They ran shrines and ceremonies that surely reinforced their own legitimacy. If you're a farmer on the outskirts delivering your grain up to the central storerooms and getting rations back, your view of this system might depend heavily on how fair it feels and on whether the palace can keep its promises. What happens if after something like Thera, crop yields dip? If seaborne trade becomes erratic? If the palace still demands the same taxes, but the feast gets smaller and the gods start looking angry? Revolts are hard to prove archaeologically. People don't leave neat inscriptions saying, "On this day, we overthrew the palace and set it on fire," but some destruction layers look almost too thorough. Storerooms burned to the ground, archives charred, central halls gutted, while simpler houses around the complex show less catastrophic damage. In a few cases, objects that look like official symbols, seals, prestige goods, end up smashed or discarded in unusual ways. Is that an earthquake? Or is that targeted rage? Then there's the external attack hypothesis. By the mid to late 15th century BCE, something new is clearly happening in the wider Ion. On the Greek mainland, in places like Mycenae, Pilis and Tyrins, militarized palaces with big fortification walls, are rising. Their elites use a different script, Linear B. Their grave goods include weapons, armor, and iconography of warriors and chariots. They look in many ways like a harder, more overtly martial version of the Manoan model. If you imagine those upstart mainland powers looking south at Cree, with its old prestigious centers, its control of sea routes, its wealthy estates, it's not hard to see motive. Some scholars picture Mayan warbands crossing over, raiding or conquering, either as a sudden invasion or as a slow drip of pressure that eventually tips into takeover. Evidence. At a couple of Cretan sites, there are hints of mainland-style weapons. At Knossos, after the Big Burn, the administration seems to resume in Linear B rather than Linear A, with a Greek language bureaucracy perched on the old Manoan foundations. That looks a lot like new rulers moving into a vacated seat. The problem is, again, timing and clarity. We don't have a neatly labeled conquest destruction layer with Mayan calling cards pinned to it. What we have is a pattern. Palaces burn, summer abandoned, set. Knossos survives as a kind of hybrid center now under mainland influence control. Over the following generations, material culture across Cree shifts closer to Mycenaean styles. Was that the result of a violent takeover, a gradual elite replacement, a combination with different outcomes at different sites? It might be all of the above depending on where you look. And lurking behind all these specific scenarios is another idea: cascading crisis. Think back to the even if it didn't directly flatten the palaces, it likely damaged ports, fleets, and overseas dependencies. Trade routes had to be rerouted or rebuilt. Partners like Akrotiri disappeared. Surplus shrank. Confidence eroded. Now layer onto that the ordinary background of earthquake risk. Add possible fluctuations in climate, a string of bad harvests here, a drought there. Insert growing competition from ambitious mainland neighbors. None of these by itself has to be the killer, but together, over a century or two, they can undermine the stability of even a sophisticated system. That's where the distinction between a single catastrophe and repeated destabilization matters. A society hit by one big disaster can paradoxically come out stronger. Rebuilding gives leaders a chance to demonstrate competence, to reward loyalty, to redesign their centers. People pull together under the banner of recovery, hit that same society again and again before it's fully recovered from the last shock, and the dynamic changes. Instead of "we can fix this," the mood shifts toward "they can't keep us safe." Trust erodes. Obligations feel heavier. Old arrangements start to look negotiable. When we look at the Manoan palatial sequence, we don't see just one destruction horizon. We see multiple episodes of damage and rebuilding. An earlier wave around 1700 BCE, after which the palaces come back even grander. Then the later, more terminal burnings in the 15th century. That earlier cycle is a great example. After the first big destructions, the so-called Neo-Palatial period sees the palaces rebuilt with even more elaborate architecture and art. Corridors of processions, grand staircases, intricate storerooms. It's as if the elites used the crisis to double down on their role. We rebuilt this world. We deserve to rule it. Rebuilding isn't just engineering, it's politics. You decide which areas get restored and which get left as rubble. You decide who gets new storage rights, new land allocations, new temple spaces. You bring in allies. You reward supporters. You sideline rivals. A post-disaster city is a blank slate that somebody gets to write on. Now, fast forward to the final destruction horizon set. At many sites, that script writing opportunity either isn't taken or isn't possible. Some palaces are not rebuilt at all. Others come back only partially. At Knossos, someone clearly has the capacity and will to restore the administrative machinery, but now in a way that aligns with mainland Greek interests. That's what a weakened network looks like. Not absolute emptiness, but an uneven field full of partially broken nodes. For an ambitious power nearby, that kind of landscape is an invitation. If you're Armenian 1A on the mainland and you see ports flickering, its palaces damaged, its local elites scrambling, this is your moment. You don't have to launch a Hollywood-style armada and conquer the island in a single campaign. You can send merchants first, then diplomats, then marriage partners, then auxiliary troops to help secure a troubled harbor. Step by step, you turn influence into leverage, leverage into control. By the time the smoke clears, the palaces are still there in some form. But the people keeping the tablets, commanding the ships, deciding where the surplus flows, those might be new faces. The end of the Manoan palatial world is visible in burnt beams and collapsed halls. What's harder to see are the conversations, the betrayals, the desperate decisions made in the years before the fires. Were angry farmers setting torches in the night? Were rival Cretan factions fighting each other in the chaos after another earthquake? Were mainland adventurers quietly backing one side and then stepping into the vacuum? The archaeology gives us the ash and rubble. The motives stay shadowy. What we can trace, though, is the aftermath, a Cretan landscape of former palaces. Some silent, one dominant, now speaking a different bureaucratic language. A civilization that once projected power across the waves has turned inward, its network frayed, its identity blurred. And on the mainland, in stone citadels that look very different from the open wall-less courts of Manoan Cree, another kind of palace is just hitting its stride. On the mainland, those other kind of palaces aren't just architectural quirks. They belong to a different civilization with a different temperament. We call them the Mycenaeans. If Manoan feels like a world of open courts and flowing processions, Mycenaean Greece feels like a clenched fist. You see it first in the hills where Minoan palaces sit low in fertile plains or on gentle rises. Mian centers like Mycenae Tyrins and Pios perch on defensible heights wrapped in enormous fortification walls. Later Greeks called those walls Cyclopean because they literally could not imagine normal humans moving stones that big. Inside those citadels, you still have storerooms, workshops, shrines, etc. You still have a central hall, the Megaron with a hearth and a throne. But the emphasis is different. The Minion Megaron is a stage for a single ruler, the one axe, rather than a broad multi-court courtyard space for fluid movement. The art on the walls leans heavily into chariots, hunting, and warriors. Bronze weapons appear not just as tools, but as prestige markers in graves. And then there's the burial style. On Cree, especially in earlier periods, you get communal tombs, cave-like chambers used by generations of a family or community. Bones get moved, reorganized, mingled. The dead are part of a long, layered ancestry. On the mainland, by the later Bronze Age, elite graves increasingly focus on individuals. Shaft graves at Mycenae, with spectacular gold masks, weapon sets, cups, and jewelry. Later, huge beehives throws tombs cut into hillsides with long Dromo passages, leading down to a single dramatic burial chamber. You're not looking at anonymous ancestors here. You're looking at named lineages asserting themselves. This one person mattered. This family matters. This hierarchy is real. Both worlds run palaces. Both store surplus, manage land, direct labor, officiate rituals. But the Mycenaean package is more overtly militarized and stratified. Their power is advertised through walls, weapons, and royal burials in a way the Manoans never quite embraced. So what happens when these two systems start to overlap? By the time the fires are flaring in the Cretan palaces, the Minion world is consolidating. Citadels across mainland Greece show increasing uniformity in architecture, pottery, and administrative practices. The linear B-crypt is being used to keep careful records in Greek. Local rulers are plugged into a shared cultural matrix that feels coordinated, not random. And out in the Aon, Mycenaean-style pottery starts showing up in places Manoans once dominated. On Cree, this isn't just a trickle. After the big destruction horizon, Mycenaean material culture surges. One of the clearest pieces of evidence for what's happening comes from the heart of the old Manoan system, Konos. Before the burn, the palace at Knossos uses Linear A, that still unread script of the Manoan administrators. Afterward, when the site is reorganized, the tablets change. Suddenly, we're looking at Linear B, same tablet shapes, same basic medium, same habit of writing on wet clay that accidentally gets fired in the destruction. But the language encoded is different. It's Greek. Archaeologists call this the Menian phase of numbers. Administratively, it behaves like a mainland palace. The tablets talk about herds, rations, textiles, bronzes, offerings to deities, all in a bureaucratic Greek that lines up closely with records from Pios and Thieves. It's as if somebody took the Manoan palatial operating system and installed a Menian language program to run on it. What does that mean in human terms? It doesn't necessarily imply a tsunami of settlers flooding across from the mainland and displacing everyone. Takeover can happen at the top. One possibility is elite replacement. Imagine a local crisis on Cree, palaces damaged, rival factions squabbling, resources tight. A mainland prince marries into a Cretan family, or a Cretan faction calls in Mienian support to win a local power struggle. In exchange for military backing, those mainland allies get positions of authority. They bring their scribes trained in Linear B. They start recording the same old flows of grain and wool using a language and script they're comfortable with. From the outside, the farmers may barely notice at first. You still deliver your produce. You still work the estate fields, but the men at the top table speak with a slightly different accent. Another possibility is administrative control without full political conquest. The Mycenaeans might not have needed to rule every village. What they really want is control over key nodes, harbors, major estates, the central palace complex. In that model, you could have a situation where Knossos becomes a mini-Anron fiscal and religious hub, orchestrating flows of goods that still come from overwhelmingly communities. The scribes might be mainlanders, the shepherds and weavers local. And then there's the long, slow option, gradual dominance. Even without dramatic battles, a militarized, coordinated mainland economy could outcompete a weakened system. Mian traders show up with desirable goods and new stylistic fashions. Local elites imitate these to keep up with their peers. Over a few generations, the alliance networks, the armor, the burial customs, the iconography, all drift towards my senior norms. By the time you look back, it looks like a takeover. But at no single moment was there a clean break. Whatever combination actually happened, the archaeological signal is clear. After the palatial burnings, Cree starts to speak the visual language of the mainland burial shift. You start seeing more individual graves with weapons and imported minion-style pottery. Tomb types and grave goods echo those on the mainland. Elite Cretans or Mycenaeans living on Cree are making statements in the symbolic vocabulary of warrior aristocracy. Weapons change too. Earlier Minoan art, even when it shows bulloping or hunting, often downplays explicit battlefield violence. The weapons you do find, like elegant rapiers, fit a world of prestige and ceremony as much as combat. In the post-destruction period, Mienian-style swords, spearheads, and armor pieces become more common. The iconography follows more shield motifs, more martial themes, more scenes of armed men striding or riding. Art turns from the fluid and often ambiguous compositions of neo-palatial Crete toward the cleaner, harder lines of Mian design. Iconography shifts. Some of the old Maioni religious imagery persists, goddesses, horns of consecration, sacred animals, but now you get them reinterpreted through a mainland lens. A pose that once evoked a Minoan priestess might now be read locally as a different kind of divine figure connected to the Mienian pantheon. Some names on Linear B tablets at Knossos, like a form of Poseidon or Zeus, appear alongside older cult symbols that once belonged to Minoan ritual spaces. It's like watching a familiar stage set, reused for a new play. Then there's the bureaucratic machinery itself. Under Minoan control, the palaces track goods using Linear A, with ceilings and tablets that we can recognize, but not fully interpret. The system seems to have its own accounting conventions, its own categories. Under my senior administration, we can read the tablets. We can see how obsessively they count livestock, textiles, bronzes, chariot parts. We can map the hierarchy of officials and see the fingerprint of a centrally controlled kingdom. The impression is that the Mycenaeans plug their own administrative logic into an existing infrastructure, storerooms, workshops, networks of dependent communities, and push it in a more militarized extraction-focused direction. And yet for all these changes, Cree doesn't just flip a switch and become a copy of my continuity threads its way through the disruption. Local potters keep using traditional clay sources and techniques even as they adopt mainland shapes and decorative motifs. You get hybrid styles, Crete and hands making Mian-looking wares with a twist. Sanctuaries that had been important for centuries continue to be visited. Offerings keep piling up in certain caves and peak sanctuaries, even as the overarching political order shifts around them. Some of the old Minoan symbols, double axes, sacred horns, certain animal combinations refuse to vanish. They're absorbed, reinterpreted, or quietly maintained alongside the new Mian gods and titles. Craft traditions, especially in things like fresco painting and fine metalwork, often look like a direct line from earlier Minoan workshops, now serving new masters. If you walked through Knossos in its Mian phase, you might still recognize the layout, the light wells, the painted walls. The language on the tablets would be different, the imagery sharper, more martial, but the bones of the place are undeniably Cretan. This is how one story overwrites another, not by erasing every trace, but by using the old script as a pimpist. The Mycenaeans don't raise, sit, and start from bare rock. They inherit a landscape dense with meaning and infrastructure, and gradually adjust its settings. Over time, when later Greeks look back, what do they remember? They remember the mainland heroes, Myene, city of Agamemnon, Pios of Netta, the fortresses, the warlords, the Trojan War tradition. Crete in their stories become something else. The place of Minos, of the Minotaur, of strange myths that feel half-remembered, half-invented, a powerful island, yes, but folded into a narrative now dominated by the MC9 experience. And because the Minion system leaves written Greek records, their version of reality has a louder voice in the surviving archive. The Minoan world continues in ghost form, in reused buildings, in stubborn local shrines, in borrowed symbols, and in the skills of artisans who grew up in an older tradition. But in terms of who gets to define what Greek civilization will later be traced back to, this period is pivotal. Mycenae rises. Crete changes hands, not necessarily once, not necessarily everywhere at the same time, but enough that when the dust settles, the mainland model is in charge of the story. And that shift from a sea-focused, relatively open, ritual-heavy, palatial culture to a more citadel-centered, war-advertising, lineage-obsessed one is one of the ways an earlier civilization starts to slip into the background, not vanished, just overshadowed. Because the next time the Aegean palaces fall, it's the Mycenaeans whose collapse will be remembered. And in that retelling, the civilization they had already overwritten becomes even easier to miss. When you fast-forward a few centuries from that Minion phase on Crete, something strange has happened to the island's past. The people actually living there still have local traditions, local shrines, local stories. But when literate Greeks of the later archaic and classical periods start putting things into writing, when they finally have the tools to turn memory into text, the Crete that appears on the page is a mythological theme park. You don't get here's how an earlier maritime civilization organized its palaces and trade routes. You get King Minos, the tyrant of Nos, demanding human tribute from Athens. You get Daedalus, the genius architect, building a labyrinth that's part prison, part supernatural maze. You get the Minotaur, a literal monster at the center of Cretan power, fed on foreign youths. That's what Minoan civilization looks like through later Greek eyes. A story about domination, monstrosity, and a heroic mainland prince, Theseus, coming in and cleaning house. Notice who gets to be the hero in that version. Not some sailor or priestess or ruler. An Athenian prince, a mainlander. The island is powerful, yes, but ultimately it's a stage for a Greek city's origin myth, a place Athens proves itself against. By the time those myths are being written down, nobody remembers Linear A. Nobody can read the old clay tablets that once tracked Cretan flocks and offerings. The palaces themselves have gone through phases of abandonment, reuse, and reinterpretation. Earthquakes, fires, and the slow grind of time have turned bright frescoes and stores into rubble and fill for later buildings. The Minion version of Crete, the one that wrote Greek with Linear, be at Nos, is already long gone too. The late Bronze Age collapse has knocked out the whole palace system, mainland and island alike. Writing disappears from Greece for centuries, so when literacy returns in the early 1st millennium BCE, when the Greeks adopt an alphabet and start writing epic poetry, law codes, history, they're leaning on oral tradition that has been free-floating for a very long time. An oral tradition doesn't preserve a civilization like an archive, it preserves a feeling. Maybe what survived in stories about Crete was a sense of an older, uncanny power in the islands. Maybe vague memories of a time when Cretan ships dominated the Aegean, collecting tribute, setting terms, maybe dim recollections of labyrinthine buildings, complex storerooms and strange bull rituals. But by the time those impressions hit the page, they've been folded into the worldview of much later societies. Homer's Crete of the 100 Cities is a place of many peoples and many tongues, but it's a backdrop, not a protagonist. Later authors turned King Minos into the world's first naval emperor, ruling the seas, stamping out piracy. Then they darken him, paint him as cruel and arbitrary. Still, others rehabilitate him as a wise lawgiver. All of this says more about what later Greeks thought kingship and sea power should look like than about what the Bronze Age Cretans actually did. This is how conquerors' record-keeping outlives the conquered. The Mycenaeans adopt parts of the system and plug Greek into it. Their language gets written. Their titles and gods show up on tablets. Their administrative habits become legible to us. When that whole world falls apart, and centuries later Greek speakers start writing again, the line of remembered ancestry runs through Myene and its kin through Agamemnon, Netta, and their legendary peers. The written self-aware tradition of we Greeks grows out of that imagined heroic past. The people who originally built the palaces had no such descendants in the textual record. They don't get to say, this is who we were, this is what we believed, this is how we saw ourselves. Their script remains undeciphered. Their bureaucratic language is locked away in signs we can copy but not read. So when later writers look back, they don't see Minoans. That term is a modern invention coined by Arthur Evans in the 20th century. Inspired by the Minos myth, the ancients themselves saw people of Cretans, followers of Minos, but always filtered through their own horizon. Meanwhile, the most detailed sources we have for the late Bronze Age Ian come from the side that wrote Greek, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians. They mention places that might be CIT, might be Ian Islands, but always as trade partners, enemies, occasional line items in royal inscriptions. In that paper trail, identity gets flattened into an entry in someone else's ledger. You can see the effect in the way classical authors talk about pre-Greek peoples more generally. They lump them together as Plaz, Lycas, Eteocretins, shadowy, vaguely defined groups that occupy the land before the Hellenes arrive. They are indigenous, mysterious, often associated with strange rites and old sanctuaries, but their individual histories, languages, and political experiments are blurred into a common haze. To a 5th century Athenian, the Bronze Age is already mythical deep time. The distinctions between a Minoan palace at Knossos and a Mycenaean citadel on the mainland are not what matters. What matters is how those distant half-remembered worlds can be deployed in present arguments about law, citizenship, warfare, or piety. So, Cree becomes a cautionary tale, or a source of exotic stories, or a prestige anchor. Our customs go back to Minos. Each retelling nudges the memory further away from whatever lived reality once existed, and the material those memories might have been checked against the original Cretan archives stays mute. This is the other part of how a civilization gets erased. The medium Minoan writing mostly survives on clay because of accidents. These were not formal, we will last forever inscriptions carved into stone. They were administrative jottings impressed into wet tablets, meant to be temporary. When buildings burned, the fire baked the clay hard, turning trash into archaeology. If they used ink on papyrus or leather for anything more permanent, treaties, hymn collections, king lists, those have vanished in the dampened heat of the Aegean. Wood, cloth, wax tablets, painted wall texts, all gone. What we're left with is a civilization where the surfaces that usually talk to us, texts, explicit self-descriptions, are almost entirely missing. An entire world of contracts, rituals, myths, and debates could have been carried on in media that archaeology almost never finds. So from our perspective, the Minoans are loud in stone and clay, but quiet in words. We see their architecture, their drainage systems, their fresco of acrobats and goddesses and strange hybrid creatures. We see their seals, their ivory carvings, their jewelry. We can map their trade routes through the distribution of their pottery. But when we ask them directly, they say they don't know. What did you call yourselves? What stories did you tell about your gods? What did you think about the sea, about power, about death? They answer in an untraceable script. That silence creates a vacuum, and in history vacuums rarely stay empty. Later cultures fill them with their own narratives. The Athenians tell the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. Roman writers like to imagine Minos as a sort of judge of the dead, sliding him into their own evolving afterlife mythology. Modern Europeans in the 19th and early 20th centuries, steeped in romantic ideas about the origins of Europe, project their anxieties and hopes onto the stunning finds at Knossos. Each layer adds an interpretation. Each interpretation risks pushing the original further out of focus. This is where archaeology becomes more than just treasure hunting. It becomes a way to argue back against the louder storytellers. Archaeologists can compare plantation-like Mycenaean estates with the more open Cretan palace landscapes and say, hold on, maybe power worked differently here. They can point out the lack of fortification walls in most Minoan sites and ask whether all that later talk of Minos, the tyrant, reflects reality or mainland fears. They can show how Cretan motifs show up in mainland graves. Her weights and measures influence my senior administration. Her Cretan goddess imagery seems to bleed into later depictions of Olympian deities. In other words, they can reconstruct the fingerprints of a culture that the texts mostly ignore or caricature. But archaeology isn't neutral either. The first big excavations at Knossos were happening in an era obsessed with finding the cradle of European civilization. Evans himself framed the Manoans as a kind of peaceful, artistic, almost utopian precursor to later Greek rationality, in contrast to the warlike Mycenaeans. That reading said as much about Edwardian anxieties over empire and industrial warfare as it did about Bronze Age Cree. Now newer generations of scholars are more cautious. They see the weapons caches, the evidence for hierarchy, the signs of control and coercion in the palatial system. The pendulum swings back. Maybe the Manoans weren't a peaceful matriarchy. Maybe they were just as political and complicated as anyone else. So even as archaeology gives the Manoans a voice, it does so in accents shaped by our own time. The reality is what we call erasure is rarely a single moment when one people vanish and another appears. It's a process. On Cree, you can watch that process unfold layer by layer. First, Minoan palaces rise and knit the island into a working system. Then, disasters and power struggles hit. Mycenaean-style elites entangle themselves with Cretan centers, altering how wealth and authority are expressed. The island gradually adopts mainland fashions, scripts, and maybe even gods without losing every thread of its older heritage. Then, the whole late Bronze Age palace world disintegrates. For centuries, writing disappears. Smaller, more localized communities carry on, drawing from whichever strands of the past still feel alive. By the time literate Greeks start telling themselves where they came from, the Cretan part of the story has been transformed, absorbed, rebranded. The double axes become symbols of strange old cults. The great courts turn into the labyrinth. King Minos becomes a character in somebody else's epic, then a legal reformer, then a judge in the underworld. The civilization that once dominated the Aegean hasn't truly vanished. Its genes continue in the people of the islands. Its symbols survive in shrines. Its building techniques echo in later architecture. Its trade routes set patterns later merchants still follow. But its name, its language, its self-understanding have been almost entirely overwritten. This is what erased usually means in deep history. Not burned out of existence in a single day, but slowly folded into the identity of the conqueror, the successor, the storyteller, with a louder pen. If you strip away the myths and the later propaganda and just follow the stuff, a different picture of erased Cree appears, because even when a civilization loses its voice, its habits have a way of sticking to other people's hands. Start with the obvious, the art. Walk through the material record of the Aon from the 18th to the 13th century BCE, and you can almost see Manoan style crawling off Cree island by island, coast by coast. Once you get those flowing, almost kinetic frescoes, blue dolphins racing across walls, youths vaulting over bulls, women with elaborate flounced skirts and bare breasts, liais eyes and crocuses winding up columns, pottery with swirling marine motifs, octopuses, argonauts, seaweed wrapped around jars like they're alive. A few generations later on the mainland, in the ancient shaft graves, you have something different. Heavy grave goods, big weapons, gold masks. The local art vocabulary is more geometric, more rigid. But as Cretan palaces peak and the Manoan network saturates the AOA, you start seeing copies. Mainland walls get fresco in a Cretan hand. Some are probably painted by Cretan artisans who've been hired or transplanted. Others are by local artists who have learned the style. At places like Pios, Mycenae, Thebes, you suddenly find bulloping scenes that look suspiciously Gnosian. You get Minoanizing processions of women and men in long flowing garments, carrying vessels, approaching what are probably shrines. Even the way figures are drawn, the profiles, the proportions, the color conventions follow a Cretan template. This isn't random borrowing. It looks like a package. You want to show that your newly rich mainland palace is plugged into the top-tier RIAN network. You don't just stockpile bronze and gold. You decorate like numbers. You import or emulate stone vases, Cretan furniture inlays, seal stones. And it isn't confined to Greece. In the buried town of Akrotiri, Cretan-style frescoes are everywhere. Some scholars think the painters may literally have come from Crete. Others argue for a strong local workshop shaped by Cretan training. Either way, the visual language is the same. Flowing plants, marine life, ritual gatherings, maybe even early versions of priestess imagery. On islands across the Cyclades, Minoan motifs start appearing on pottery and small objects. In coastal Anatolia, you see style stonework and iconography mixing with local traditions. In Cyprus, forms and decorative choices seep into local ceramics and luxury goods. This is what influence looks like before anyone is writing art theory. But the visual style is only the surface layer. Underneath is the machinery that made that style profitable. Ships, harbors, and a particular way of thinking about the sea. When later Greeks imagine Minos as master of the sea, they're projecting backward, but they're not inventing from nothing. The archaeological footprint of Cretan maritime power is real. Cretan-style ship models, anchor types, and harbor installations show up along the coasts of the southern Aegean. Wrecks carry goods, packed in recognizable manno in jars. Harbor towns in the Cyclades and along the Anatolian coast start adopting similar layouts. Quays, storage areas, shrine spaces, overlooking anchorages. There's a strong case that Cretans, or people trained in ways, helped standardize what a Bronze Age port looked like and how it functioned. That includes how you move cargo and how you record it. Those undeciphered linear tablets from Sit are frustrating as texts, but as objects, they're very clear about something. There was an established way to count things, track offerings, measure volume and weight, and distribute goods. The symbols for fractions, the layout of accounts, the repeated pairing of certain signs with certain containers. All of that shows a mature administrative system. Then, on the mainland, when the Mycenaeans finally start writing Greek in Linear B, what do? They adopt not just the script, but the whole logic of record-keeping. The same basic tablet shapes, the same practice of grouping entries by location or commodity. Very similar systems of weights and measures. Even some of the ideograms, little pictograms for man, woman, tripod, cloth, oil, carryover. Here, of all places, you can see a fairly direct line of cultural inheritance. You don't develop a complex administrative notation from scratch overnight. You borrow one that already works. And once you have that borrowed system in place, it starts setting expectations. If you're an elite in Pios or Thieves, your scribes are managing flocks, grain, oil, textiles in a way that looks a lot like what their predecessors and counterparts did in numbers. That shapes how you think about property, labor, taxation, and ritual offerings. Even if the language on the tablets has shifted from whatever the Cretans spoke to Mayan Greek, the underlying habits of tracking and controlling resources are part of the Minoan legacy. The influence goes beyond bookkeeping. Look at early Greek religion. This is one of those heavily debated zones where scholars argue about everything, but there are some suggestive overlaps. The Minoan world is saturated with images of powerful female figures in elaborate dress flanked by animals holding snakes standing on mountaintops between lions. Shrines are often on peaks or in caves. Sacred symbols include double axes, horns of consecration, trees, pillars. Centuries later in Greek religion, you get Artemis as mistress of animals, Potia Theron. You get Hera on hilltop sanctuaries, Athena with her goats and snakes, deer in caves and hidden places. You get mountain peaks and caves as persistent sacred sites, some of them continuously used from the Bronze Age onward. You find Greek cult titles like Potna, mistress, that show up in Linear B tablets, probably borrowed from an older Aeon religious vocabulary. You see double axes and horn-like symbols in later Greek sanctuaries. Not everywhere, not always, but enough to make people ask questions. Is Athena's snake or Zeus's identity as a Cretan-raised god in some myths a direct survival from Minoan worship, or a mainland religion that absorbed and repurposed island symbols? We can't say with certainty. There's no bilingual "this is the same goddess" inscription, but the continuity of sites, symbols, and certain ritual gestures like processions, libation tables, and bench sanctuaries strongly suggest that early Greek religion didn't spring from nowhere. It grew in soil that had already been cultivated by people in the Minoan orbit. The same is true of elite display. A Mayan ruler who fills his grave with gold cups adorned with sea creatures and spirals is sending a message. I'm tied into the sea network. I can command the luxuries that once flowed through Crete. Wearing Cretan-style jewelry or using imported Minoan stone vases at feasts turn someone's body and table into a billboard of connectivity. Over time, those choices harden into norms. Certain shapes of cups, certain decorative bands on jars, certain colors of wall painting become what proper high-status architecture and dining look like in the Aeon. When later Greeks build their own temples and public spaces, they create a sense of community and shared identity. Some of those inherited sensibilities echo in choices about column spacing, light wells, painted decoration. It's not that a 5th-century architect is consciously copying numbers, is that the whole region's idea of what a prestigious built environment looks like been shaped by centuries of Manon and Manon-descended models. And this is where it helps to be precise about what we mean by Europe. In Bronze Age terms, Europe isn't a political or cultural bloc. It's a geography. What the men's really touch directly is the Aeon Basin and the coasts plugged into it. Southern Greece, the Chelades, Western Anatolia, Cyprus, parts of the Eastern Mediterranean, where their ships regularly show up further afield in Italy, in the central Mediterranean up the Adriatic. Their goods travel, their motifs appear, but usually as part of a mixed cargo of influences. So when we talk about a civilization shaping Europe, we're mostly talking about how it set patterns in this maritime zone that later European societies would inherit indirectly, via the Greeks, and then via the Romans, and then via all the cultures that saw themselves as heirs of that classical world. Some of those connections are pretty solid. We can trace specific pottery styles like the so-called marine style radiating out from Crete and being copied elsewhere. We can follow the adoption of weights and scribble habits into my senior administration. We can map where Cretanent-type sanctuaries appear far from the island. Other links are more speculative. Did a Minoan sense of the sea as a unifying space, a field to be managed and patrolled, influence later Greek ideas of theocracy, sea empire? Maybe. Did Cretan goddess imagery feed directly into the iconography of Aphrodite or Hera or Athena? Possibly, but the chain is long and full of reinterpretation. Archaeologists and historians spend a lot of time arguing about where to draw that line between direct inheritance and looser diffusion. Sometimes what looks like a Manon survival might just be different societies facing similar problems, such as how to build on unstable ground or how to symbolize authority and independently arriving at similar solutions. What's clear, though, is that Crete was one of the first places in this part of the world to put a full package together. Palatial centers, standardized administration, wide-reaching maritime trade, a distinctive art style, and a regional religious vocabulary. Once that package existed, it didn't stay home. It bled into the practices of neighbors, rivals, successors. It helped define what power looked like around the Aeon. And even after the palaces fell, after Linear A and B went silent, pieces of that package kept circulating. They show up in shrines, reused for 1,000 years. In myths that relocate gods, but keep their mountain and cave settings, in the shapes of cups and the roots of merchants. In the very idea that a sea could be an empire's road instead of its wall. Names vanish, languages die, scripts become puzzles in museum cases, but the habits they carried of counting, building, decorating, worshipping, sailing can persist long enough that no one remembers where they started. That is what Minoan influence looks like from our end of time. Not a quoted source we can footnote, but fingerprints on everything nearby, smudged and partial, still visible long after the hand that left them has disappeared. For all of that, for all the fingerprints and echoes, there's a hard truth we keep circling back to with the Minoans. There are some things we simply still don't know, not because no one has tried to find out, because the key pieces are missing or buried or written in a language that sits right in front of us and still refuses to talk. Start with the biggest blank, their words. We do not know what the Minoans called themselves. We do not know what they called their island, their gods, their rulers, their enemies, their neighbors. We have their script, Linear A, on hundreds of clay tablets and seals and ritual objects. We can read the signs in the sense that we can copy them, classify them, see which ones tend to go together. We can guess that this sign probably means wine or oil or figs because it appears next to pictures of jars or certain types of offerings. We can see fractions and totals and something that looks a lot like bookkeeping, but we don't know the language behind the signs. Linear B, the later script used by the Mycenaeans, turned out to be an early form of Greek. Once that breakthrough happened in the 1950s, people hoped Linear A would fall in line. Maybe an older Greek dialect, maybe something related. So far, it hasn't. Every serious attempt to match linear A to known languages, Greek, Luwian, Semitic, something from Anatolia, something from the Near East runs into walls. Some signs behave like syllables, some like logs. The distribution of vowels doesn't look quite right for anything we know. The short inscriptions give us almost no running text, no verbs we can pin down, no repeating and the king did X formula to grab. It's like having hundreds of grocery receipts from a vanished culture, when what you really want is just one letter, one ritual chant, one treaty. Until that language is identified, or until some miracle bilingual turns up, a Cretan version of the Rosetta Stone, we are guessing at a fundamental layer of Manon reality. That uncertainty spills out into everything else. Take politics. Were the palaces on She all part of a single centralized state under a king Minos? Or were they separate regional powers? Konos, Phistos, Malia, Zakros, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, bound more by shared culture and trade than by a single crown. The architecture gives mixed signals. On one hand, the repeated layout of palaces, central courts, magazines, standardized storage, similar shrine arrangements, looks like some kind of island-wide coordination set. The ceilings, the standardized weights, the distribution of certain luxury goods suggest a network that's tightly integrated. On the other hand, there are no obvious fortifications linking one palace's territory to another. No monumental victory steelily boasting about conquered cities. No clear icon of a singular larger-than-life monarch dominating every surface the way you see with pharaohs in Egypt or kings in Mesopotamia. In their place, you get repeated images of what might be priestesses or high-status women, processions of elites, horn symbols, double axes, sacred trees and pillars. Power seems to be expressed through ritual, through participation in shared religious forms, not through one face carved 50 times larger than everyone else. Does that mean Cree was ruled by priest-kings, by councils of palatial elites, by families that blended religious and economic authority without the absolute hierarchy we associate with later empires? We don't know. Linear tablets probably contain hints, titles, lists of officials, maybe even words that correspond to governor or overseer or lord. But without understanding the language, we're stuck at the level of patterns and guesswork. We can see that someone was in charge of redistributing grain, oil, textiles. We can tell that some sanctuaries were under palace oversight. We can track offerings that look like taxes or tribute set. We just can't hear how the people doing that work thought of themselves. Then there's the collapse. We've talked about the shifting balance of power between Cree and the Minion mainland. We've walked through the fires, the destructions, the Minion takeover of Konos. But the precise sequence, the exact way that this web of palaces and ports and rituals unraveled, is still being stitched together in real time. New excavations keep adding pieces. In some Cretan sites, careful stratigraphy shows earthquake damage without fire, then rebuilding, then later burning. In others, you get multiple destruction layers close together, suggesting a century or two of repeated shocks rather than a single apocalypse. Seismologists map the active faults under the AON and try to match them to the patterns of collapsed walls and twisted floors. Terror specialists analyze volcanic ash in thin soil layers, tying it to specific eruptions, not just but a whole sequence of smaller events that might have messed with climate and agriculture. Isotope studies take teeth and bones from burial sites and ask different questions. Where did these people grow up? What did they eat? Do the diets change between one generation and the next? Do you suddenly see more mainland-style diets showing up on CYST at the same time Mayam material appears? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes it's messier. Ancient DNA, where it survives, adds another dimension, but with big caveats. The warm, wet Mediterranean climate is not kind to genetic material. We have only a small set of Manoan genomes, and they don't tell a movie-ready story of simple replacement. What they suggest instead is continuity with earlier Ion populations, plus some mixture over time from people coming in from the east and perhaps the mainland. Mayans and Minoans look genetically close, not identical, but related branches off a shared regional tree. So when NSUS takes on Mayan features after about 1450 BCE, Greek language in Linear B, different burial customs, new pottery shapes, it might not reflect a massive incoming population so much as a shift in who holds power and what styles that power chooses to wear, which leads to the collapse hypothesis. If you line up all the data we have, several possible stories emerge. None are mutually exclusive. They probably braided together. One interpretation is environmental strain, multiple earthquakes, the eruptions, fallout, possible short-term climate disruptions, maybe shifts in rainfall or harvest reliability. An island economy built on high-volume trade and intensive agriculture might have been vulnerable to just a few bad years in a row. Food insecurity undercuts elite legitimacy fast. Another is geopolitical squeeze. As Mycenaean palaces mature on the mainland, they may have started capturing more of the trade routes and raw materials that had once fed Cretan centers. If key partners in Anatolia, Cyprus, or the Levant began dealing more directly with Pios, palaces might have found their profit margins narrowing. Add in raids, piracy, and shifting alliances, and suddenly master of the sea is more aspiration than reality. A third interpretation is internal fragmentation. Palatial systems that centralize storage and redistribution are great when everything flows smoothly. They are brittle when local elites feel shut out or when regional centers start competing for the same limited prestige goods. Some of the fire layers in Cretan palaces might reflect local rebellions, factional infighting or coups that got out of hand, not just foreign invasion. And finally, there's simple cultural takeover. You don't always need massive violence to erase a way of life from the record. A century or two of minion rule at Knossos, using Greek and administration, burying elites in mainland styles, reshaping cult sites to fit their own pantheon, could slowly drown out Minoan-specific practices. When the whole Late Bronze Age system crashes around 1200 BCE, palaces burning across the eastern Mediterranean, whatever remained of uniquely Cretan bureaucracy and court culture might have been too thin to regenerate. Those are interpretations. They fit some of the evidence. They clash with other bits. And as new data comes in, they get revised, which loops us back to Linear A and what it could do to all of this. If someone somewhere finally cracks that script, not halfway, not this sign maybe means goat, but fully, our picture of Manon could change overnight. Imagine if we suddenly had ration lists that mentioned specific officials by title and name. Inventories that distinguish between palace land and temple land and communal land. Dedicatory inscriptions that say X, daughter of Y, offers this to the Lady of Z, giving us real personal and divine names. Treaties or guest gift records that actually list foreign policies, anchoring the network with proper nouns instead of guesswork. Language has a way of rearranging the furniture in a story. It can take what we thought was a single Minoan goddess and split her into a family of deities with different functions and histories. It can turn what we thought were warehouse accounts into religious calendars. It can show us whether Minos was a title, a dynasty, or a later Greek projection onto a palette of Cretan rulers who had entirely different names. Until that happens, we live in a weird emotional space with the Minoans. We can see their world in extraordinary detail. The patterns on their cups, the pigments on their walls, the grooves worn into thresholds by generations of feet. We can tell when someone switched from drinking local wine to imported stuff. We can map where their obsidian came from and how their harbor keys were aligned, but we can't hear them. Their conversations in courtyards, their arguments in council rooms, their whispered prayers in caves and on mountain tops, all of that passes through our fingers like water. What we're left with is a sophisticated world, glimpsed through fragments. A civilization that clearly mattered enormously to its neighbors, that helped set the terms of power and piety around the Aegean, and yet speaks to us mostly through styles other people borrowed and stories other people told, which raises an uncomfortable thought. How many other societies were there before Greece, before Rome, before the Textavi empires of the Near East that shaped the lives around them, and then vanished so completely we don't even have their broken scripts? The Minoans stand out partly because they left palaces big enough to survive art, vivid enough to fascinate modern eyes, and just enough writing to mock us. But they also stand as a reminder that history, as we usually tell it, is not a record of everything that mattered, is a record of what managed to survive long enough in sturdy enough form to be noticed. In the next section, we're going to push that idea even further. Because behind the Minoans, behind the glittering palaces and the painted walls of Cree, there's an even older story, a civilization behind the curtain, woven into our DNA and buried under our myths, that ruled its world long before anyone in Europe had heard the name Greece at all. So, let's pull that curtain back. If you zoom out far enough in time, past Bronze Age palaces and painted fresco, past the first Greek speakers and even past the earliest farmers who ever sowed grain in European soil, the shape of the map changes. Europe stops being a cluster of kingdoms and city-states and becomes something else, a habitat, a set of climates, coastlines, mountain passes, and river valleys being explored by people who had no idea they were European at all. By the time the first Manoan sailors were tacking across the Aon, those people had already been here for hundreds of thousands of years. We usually tell that story as background noise. Neanderthals in damp caves, early modern humans trudging through glaciers, anonymous hunters following herds. But that flattens what was probably in its own terms a long-lasting adaptive and extraordinarily successful civilization. Not civilization in the later sense of stone walls and written laws. Civilization in the deeper sense, a way of being human together that persists across millennia, that shapes landscapes, that leaves marks on bodies and minds and myths. The genetic and archaeological evidence we walked through earlier points to a simple but unsettling idea. Before there was Greek culture, before there was anything we'd recognize as classical, there was a shared human project across this whole region. A post-bottleneck three-species experiment in being human that covered Africa, Western Asia, and the future Europe like a network of dim scattered lights. Europe was one of the main theaters of that experiment. Those Neanderthal hunters perfecting cold weather survival in Ice Age valleys. They weren't a sideshow. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were the dominant human presence across Europe and Western Asia. Those early Homo sapiens pushing north from the Levant, learning the rhythms of unfamiliar winters, building camps along rivers that would one day have Greek cities on their banks. They weren't preludes. They were the cutting edge of a human lineage that had just barely survived annihilation. They met, they mixed. They traded genes and probably tools and maybe stories. They co-created the human ecology of this place long before anyone carved a column or sang about Olympus. When you look at it that way, the civilization behind the curtain isn't a single lost kingdom with a name we've forgotten. It's the whole deep layer of human adaptation that made later cultures possible. Manoan palaces don't come out of nowhere. The seafaring expertise, the social glue, the capacity to plan harvests and keep accounts and hold complex rituals, those aren't inventions of a single brilliant generation on Cree. They're the latest refinement of skills that had been evolving since tiny bands of desperate bottleneck survivors first figured out how to share information well enough not to die. The same is true for Greece. When Greek myths talk about older races of humans, the age of heroes, the age of bronze, people who lived closer to the gods and then vanished, they may be doing what stories often do, compressing a long, complicated prehistory into a few vivid images. Behind those images, we can glimpse shadows of real things, memories of a landscape already full of sacred caves and mountaintops when the first Greek speakers arrived, buried recall of powerful islands in the sea, long before Athens versus Sparta meant anything, faint echoes of older people who were not just barbarians or giants in the imagination of later writers, but heirs to that deep post-bottleneck human project. The Manoans sit right at the hinge point between those worlds. On one side, the long, largely unwritten age of hunters, foragers, early farmers, and multiple human species sharing a continent. On the other, the age of texts, empires, named battles, and people whose writings survive, often enough that we start to mistake their slice of time for the whole story. If there's one takeaway from their story, it's this. Before Greece became a word on a map, Europe had already been shaped by a succession of power centers and knowledge traditions. Manoan was one of the most important of those, a maritime hub that stitched together the Eastern Mediterranean, exported styles and rituals, and quietly helped set the starting conditions for what would later look like Greek civilization. They matter not because later Greeks copied them line for line, but because they occupied the stage first, set the lighting, and taught the orchestra how to play. And yet, in the standard version of European history, they almost vanish. Why? Partly because their own words are locked away in Linear A, partly because their greatest monuments were reused, repainted, and repurposed by others, partly because the final spectacular collapse of the Bronze Age drowned out their specific memory in a broader regional catastrophe. But there's a deeper reason too. Our story of Europe begins in earnest only when the sources become comfortable to us. When the scripts look familiar, when the languages can be slotted into family trees, when we can quote people directly. Anything before that tends to get folded into a vague prehistory. The Minoans, and the vast older human world behind them, show why that's a mistake. Their palaces, their genes, their half-read tablets keep whispering the same uncomfortable message. What we can see is not all that there was. What we can read is not all that mattered. And if that's true for Cree, a place with monumental ruins and near-miss writing, what about the societies that left lighter footprints? Coastal cultures drowned by rising seas since the last ice age. River-end towns built in floodplains where later erosion took everything. Highland networks that farmed and traded for centuries without ever stacking stones in a way that would impress modern archaeologists. How many of those have we lost so completely that even their ghosts don't show up in our textbooks? We may never have full answers. But that, in a way, is the invitation to look at a map of Europe and see not just Greece and Rome and the familiar dots of civilization, but a palimpsest layer over layer of human experiments, most of them anonymous, all of them necessary. If you've enjoyed wandering through that older, stranger version of Europe with me, past the famous ruins and into the deep background, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. I'd love to hear from you in the comments, especially where you're listening from. Are you in a place that has visible ruins from the classical world, or are you sitting over ground whose stories have mostly vanished from view? And if this kind of deep-time detective work speaks to you, there's more waiting off YouTube. I've put together a book that dives into prehistoric secrets like these bottlenecks, lost coasts, quiet power centers that shaped history before history was written. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepertimehistory.com. Because if the Minoans and the civilization behind them teach us anything, it's that the real beginning of Europe's story is still mostly in the dark, and we're only just starting to turn on the lights. Good night.